All right, good morning, everyone. Good evening to people joining us from Seoul or from other parts of Asia. My name is Daniel Wirtz, and I'm Program Manager at the National Committee on North Korea. Very pleased to have you all with us today for discussion on U.S. China Strategic Competition and its implications for the Korean Peninsula. We're excited to be joined by Ambassador Chun Yung-woo of the Korean Peninsula Future Forum, Yoon Soon of the Stimson Center, and in conversation with Scott Snyder of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Chun has had a distinguished career as a South Korean diplomat. He was the head of the South Korean delegation to the Six-Party Talks from 2006 through 2008, the South Korean Vice Foreign Minister from 2009 to 2010, and National Security Advisor to ROK President Lee Myung-bak from 2010 through 2013. He's currently head of the Korean Peninsula Future Foundation, which focuses on strategies for change in North Korea. Yoon Soon is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center, where she focuses on Chinese foreign policy and U.S. China relations. Previously, from 2011 through 2014, she'd served as a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and from 2008 through 2011 as a China analyst for the International Crisis Group, where she was based in Beijing. And Scott Snyder, our moderator and host today, is Senior Fellow for Korean Studies and Director of the Program on U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served as Director for the Center on U.S. Korea Policy at the Asia Foundation. Scott is also the co-chair of the Advisory Committee for the National Committee on North Korea. He's the author of several books, including most recently South Korea at the Crossroads, Autonomy and Alliances in an Era of Great Power Rivalry, and before that, China's Rise and the Two Koreas, both of which very pertinent for our discussion today. Scott will lead a discussion with our speakers for the first half of the program, followed by audience Q&A. As we reach the start of the audience Q&A section, you can use the raise hand function to join the queue for questions. We will, as you're called upon, unmute you remotely and allow you to use your audio to ask the question. Alternatively, if you'd like, you can use the chat function to enter your question. We plan to wrap up today by 10:15, and I'll turn it over to Scott to begin. Scott?
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you to NCNK for sponsoring this discussion, a very timely discussion about U.S. China strategic competition in the Korean Peninsula. And I'm really pleased to have Ambassador Chun and Yoon to lead our discussion. And really what I want to do, initially is just to talk about how we've seen a pretty dramatic deterioration in U.S.-China relations over the course of the recent weeks with reciprocal demands for the closure of consulates in Houston and Chengdu. We've seen indictments of Chinese individuals accused of working as agents to steal U.S. technology and health-related secrets. We've seen a series of speeches from the Trump administration, from National Security Advisor O'Brien, from FBI Director Wray, Attorney General Barr, and Secretary Pompeo. And we've seen a pretty sharp U.S. response to China's passage of a new security law in Hong Kong. There's the ongoing issue of the detention of Uyghurs. And we have a global technology competition over 5G and a pretty dramatic shift in response in recent weeks and months by the rest of the world to China. And all this, as we know, is in the context of a November election campaign. And so, and a pandemic. And so I want to start by asking Yoon to say a little bit about how China is viewing the downturn in the relationship and what we might expect, especially in the context of the elections.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me. And thanks to NCNK. So on the issue of how China views American politics today, I think the first point is that the Chinese see that all these recent retaliation cycle, tit for tat, all the issues that you have mentioned, the Chinese attribute all of them to the American election politics. And this is problematic because it automatically presents China as the innocent player, and we all know that China is not. So in the Chinese perception, at least their preference currently has evolved from pre-COVID-19 stage to now. So before the COVID-19, the Chinese was thinking that, well, maybe a second term by Trump will be beneficial to China's national interest because of how much damage he has done to the American global leadership and to the American alliance system all over the world. But I think COVID-19 shows the Chinese that under domestic political stress, Trump really has no bottom line coming to foreign policy and coming to his actions and policies towards China. So there are a lot of strategic thinkers in China feel that COVID-19 disrupted Trump's re-election campaign strategy because the economic achievement on the stock market, for example, were completely evaporated because of COVID. So as a result, they see that Trump is targeting China to shift the blame in order to win the re-election. So I think for the Chinese at this point, especially after seeing how Trump behaves under extreme pressure, the Chinese would like to see a Biden presidency starting from next year. They see that Biden might still share that bipartisan consensus that China is a national security threat for the United States. But they see that Biden's priorities, styles, and approaches are going to be very different. And that will be reflected on the issue of trade, on the issue of America alliance, and also on issues that the Chinese believe that Biden will have to resort to cooperation with China to resolve, such as the issue of North Korea or global climate change. So thank you.
Yeah. And so, Ambassador Chun, in that context, how is South Korea, how's the Moon administration viewing the impact of rising China-U.S. tensions? And what do you think are the implications strategically for South Korea going forward?
Well, first of all, I would also like to thank National Committee on North Korea for organizing this very timely webinar, and I'm very pleased to be in this webinar. I think U.S.-China tensions present a real dilemma for the Moon Jae-in administration, even a nightmare for the ROK government. Instinctively, ROK or the Moon administration will do all it can to stay away from Sino-U.S. competition and bury his head in the sand. Korea is like, or is often compared to a dolphin, trapped between two whales. Some people describe Korea as a shrimp, but I think we are bigger than a shrimp, as big as a dolphin. President Moon or his administration is very much worried about the collateral damage to be caused by the unbridled U.S.-China rivalry and the return of great power politics in this neighborhood. Geographical proximity and the structure of Korea's interests severely constrain the ROK's choice in this competition between China and the U.S. ROK's national security interests and economic interests run in opposite directions. As you know, our security interest lies with the U.S. U.S. is our ultimate guarantor of national security. China certainly is a potential long-term threat to the Republic of Korea beyond North Korea. I think China is the biggest challenge to our national security. But at the same time, it is the largest source of bread and butter. So Korea doesn't want to be to put ourselves in a position to choose the alliance at the expense of bread when it confronts, under normal circumstances. But when it confronts an existential threat from China, we will certainly choose alliance. But excessive economic interdependence means that it raises the threshold for any policy deemed as hostile by China. We cannot just sacrifice our economic partnership with China just for just because the U.S. wants us to join them in bashing China. That's the dilemma that ROK faces. So any deterioration in U.S.-China relations will deepen the schizophrenia and ambivalence in the Moon administration's national security policy and foreign policy. On North Korea, by contrast, I think Pyongyang, the impact on North Korea will be more limited. For North Korea, the worst nightmare is U.S. and China ganging up against North Korea to squeeze them into denuclearization. So when the relationship between U.S. and China is deteriorating, I think North Korea will be delighted. They have more room of maneuver. They have an opportunity to play U.S. and China off against each other. So I think they will feel more comfortable and happier, when U.S. and China are at odds than when they are on good terms.
Thank you, Ambassador Chun. I think that's a great description of the dynamic in terms of Korea's view between the U.S. and China. And of course, the missile defense issue and the deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System in South Korea a few years ago, and China's economic retaliation for that deployment has really been a kind of case study for South Korea's constrictions in terms of its ability to choose and navigate between economic dependence on China and dependence on the U.S. for security. But I'm wondering, in recent years, since the THAAD deployment, are there other areas where South Korea is really feeling pressure to choose between the U.S. and China?
Well, I think China's pressure over the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system by the U.S. has fundamentally changed the threat perceptions about China. China's retaliation, the way they retaliated against the ROK, indeed came as a watershed in ROK-China relations. So all favorable sentiment toward China and any illusion about a benign rise of China has evaporated overnight. And the Korean people woke up to the stark realities of China's rise and its hegemonic ambitions on the Korean Peninsula. According to the polls, negative sentiment about China jumped from around 60% before the THAAD deployment to over 80% after the THAAD, or China's retaliation against the THAAD. So I can say that THAAD was a real milestone in changing the relations between, or sentiment about China in Korea.
Yeah,
and
so
the episode, yeah.
I'm just going to jump in here, and I want to ask you, Ambassador Chun, what you think the next THAAD issue is going to be for South Korea, where it's really forced to navigate between the US and China. But before I do that, I want to turn to Yun and ask about the extent to which China is really targeting the alliance as it deals with the Korean Peninsula. Is that what was underlying the THAAD issue, and to what extent does Chinese rhetoric opposing alliances in the US-led security architecture manifest a certain negative view by China towards US-Korea alliance? You know, Jung Pak has just done this paper that argues that China is targeting the linchpin being the US-Korea alliance. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about the extent to which that thesis is really front and center as China looks at South Korea.
I think that is pretty much correct. I think the issue of the U.S. ROK alliance has always been a critical consideration in China's policy towards the Korean Peninsula. So not only South Korea, but also North Korea. Coming to the future, what the Chinese call the future arrangement on the Korean Peninsula. So the first question that the Chinese have in mind, although they won't raise it, they won't be the first one to raise it, is that what's going to happen to the U.S. ROK alliance in the future, presumably a unified Korean Peninsula. So I think that is the underlying, the most important issue. And if you look at the Chinese desired endgame for the Korean Peninsula, it has always been a pro-China North Korea, and at the minimum and the South Korea that is at the minimum neutral between United States and China. And that neutrality is viewed through the lens of political and security affairs. Because for the Chinese, a neutral South Korea in terms of political and security issues is very beneficial for China because of the geographical proximity and also the weight of the bilateral economic relations between China and South Korea. A politically neutral South Korea is almost guaranteed, at least in the Chinese perception, guaranteed to be pro-China in the end, and are going to make choices that won't damage China's national interest. So if you consider the current situation where the US ROK alliance is in existence and is fairly strong, and considering that the Chinese may oppose the US ROK alliance, but their ability to damage it or weaken it or to undermine it is quite limited. So I think what the Chinese priority currently can be described as is the Chinese are trying their best to weaken the strength and the elasticity of the US ROK alliance, especially given what the Chinese saw happening between US and South Korea, for example, on the issue of burden sharing, on the issue of what is the utility of US troops on the Korean Peninsula. I think the Chinese are exploiting those moments and poach South Korea for an enhanced Chinese influence over the South Korean national security perception and their decision-making down the road. Thank you.
Okay, so if the Chinese strategy is to force choices, Ambassador Chun, I'm going to come back and ask you, what do you think are the next choices that South Korea is going to feel forced to make?
Well, I think China will do all it can to divide, weaken, and destroy the ROK-US alliance, because that's in their vital national security interest. And that's the way they can win, or at least not to lose in this strategic competition with the US. So I have no doubt about that. And so I think China will continue to pressure ROK to, at least not to deploy more THAAD missile defense systems in Korea, and if possible, to withdraw the THAAD system already deployed. But I think beyond that, if they can live with that, I think another issue that they will pressure the ROK to stay away from is U.S. Intention to deploy intermediate range missiles, INF, in East Asia. And if U.S. wants to deploy these ballistic INF missiles on the Korean Peninsula in South Korea, I think China will do everything to intimidate, to coerce the ROK not to accept U.S. INF on the Korean Peninsula. And I think, of course, they will also press us to not to join the U.S.-led coalition in boycotting Huawei. Is it Huawei, the telecommunication giant's 5G system? So these are more kind of trade issues, technology issues. But I think INF will, in my view, down the road will become a bigger issue if and when U.S. Decides to go ahead with deployment of INF in East Asia.
Okay, thanks, Ambassador Chun. That was, I think, a great answer about the strategic mid to long-term possible choices. But now I want to switch to another front in pressure on South Korea, and that is pressure from the United States on burden sharing. President Trump's statements characterizing South Korea as a free rider. We know about the announcement of U.S. Withdrawal of 12,000 troops from Germany, or reconfiguration of part of that force within Europe. How do these issues influence South Korean views of U.S. reliability and therefore influence Korean views on how best to deal with China?
I think there are better ways to deal with the burden sharing issue. And the disputes over burden sharing, this will erode the credibility of the alliance. And I think they will also send the wrong messages to China. It could send a message to China that they can divide and destroy the alliance. They have a better chance to do that. So I think China will see opportunities to weaken the alliance in Trump's transactional approach to alliance. So I think this will have only negative effect on U.S. strategy in dealing with China. It will weaken U.S. hand in the strategic competition with China. A robust alliance, I think it serves U.S. interests better in strengthening its position in dealing with China. So I think this is a bad idea to make a big deal out of this, burden sharing. This doesn't really deserve such a high level of attention. That can be better left to the working level experts, as they have been done in the past. Okay, I don't know how we can get out of this.
Yeah, so the message I'm hearing from you is that in the context of rising strategic competition with China, the U.S. should be aware of own goals. And the question is, how can South Korea help the United States to prevent own goals from being scored? Now, in your earlier response, you had suggested the extent to which China sees the peninsula through a geostrategic lens, and as important for China's security, and kind of suggested that the economic influence, growing economic influence, is going to be a way for China to exert broader influence that might have strategic benefits. But I'm wondering, do you see a proactive strategy from Beijing for winning South Korean hearts and minds? Is it enough to use economic cooperation to make South Korea neutral, or ultimately, do you think that China will develop a Korea-focused strategy that is intended to actually win South Korea over while using North Korea as a buffer?
Thank you, Scott. I really enjoyed the discussion you and Ambassador had about the issue of the alliance. One thing that I would like to point out, and this is related to the question that you just raised, is that the US and South Korean definition of breaking the alliance is very different from the Chinese definition, because the reference points are vastly different. Because China is the one who is trying to challenge or undermine or weaken the alliance. So any sign of US inaction, for example, regarding the THAAD and all the pressures that South Korea had to take from China, or any sign of US pressing the alliance in financial terms, like what we have seen, or any sign of South Korea, the allies' neutrality, or for example, on the issue of AIIB, or South Korea's hesitation, will be seen as victories by China towards that goal. So I can hardly imagine a scenario where one big event makes the alliance break down completely, but it is a constant process of erosion, attrition, and frictions with the US from doubts and disappointments, and the process of the Chinese engagement and deepening ties from economic to political that will thin out the elasticity and the credibility of the alliance. So from the Chinese point of view, if they can use different events to test and weaken the credibility of the alliance by sowing the seeds of doubts and discontent, and by showing South Korea Chinese benevolence and Chinese generosity, especially in economic terms, then the goal of breaking the alliance will have been achieved from the Chinese perspective. So it's a process instead of one definitive event. So looking at what the Chinese have been doing in the past, I would say a year to 2 years, the Chinese have been gradually and actually quite dramatically strengthening the relationship with South Korea, including senior leader visits. President Moon visited China, both in Beijing and Chengdu last December, including the promotion of the service trade agreement under the China-South Korea Free Trade Agreement to help the South Korean financial institutions to enter the Chinese market. And also using the COVID period as an example, the mutual assistance, the mutual supply of medical assistance with medical supplies at the early stage of the COVID. And starting from early May, China and South Korea, I think, are the first two countries to start what they call a fast track channel to restore to restore the travel between China and South Korea. And then also on the issue of the Northeast Asia regional cooperation, the Chinese pretty much have elevated South Korea to the most prioritized country in that scheme, because in the Chinese perception, Russia's priority is with Europe, and Japan is confined by historical issues. So they see that cooperation between China and South Korea is the main pillar for the regional economic cooperation in Northeast Asia. So I would say that although on one hand, the Chinese realize that its U.S. ROK alliance is a fact, and the Chinese cannot change it in the immediate future. But what the Chinese is trying to do is to deeply or more deeply tie South Korea into the Chinese orbit. So the Chinese do understand that in the foreseeable future, South Korea's strategic choices is going to be one, at least from the Chinese perception, is going to be a hedging strategy between US and China. Basically continue to develop economic ties with China and also rely on the alliance for security. But this type of hedging strategy is, at least in the Chinese perception, is already a success. That South Korea, instead of completely relying on the United States, now South Korea is hedging. So they see the position of South Korea is already moving on that scale towards the Chinese end. So I think that's the Chinese approach. It's not it's not a strategy that's aimed at immediate gains, but it is aimed at gradually tying South Korea more deeply into the Chinese orbit.
Okay, those are some great points, really, that China is pursuing an evolutionary strategy toward weakening the alliance that is really more aimed at de facto neutralization. It reminds me of the frog in the water that is gradually getting warmer. And so I'm wondering, Ambassador Chun, at what point will South Korea feel the heat? And is there a recognition that the temperature is getting warmer in South Korea, especially with the Moon administration? Yoon talked about South Korean presidential engagement in China, but of course we know that President Xi was expected to visit South Korea this year. And that presumably would be an important step forward from a South Korean perspective in improving the relationship with China. How do you view the Moon administration's approach toward China, and are they susceptible to allowing the temperature to be turned up too high?
I think you have to distinguish between the Moon administration and the Korean general public. President Moon is working very hard to catch up with China, despite the retaliation from China over the South deployment. He just wants to get it behind us and move on with China. And he's very keen on getting President Xi to visit Korea within this year. And he has been working very hard on that. And he has been trying very hard not to offend China. And yeah, I agree with Yoon that the ROK government has been skillfully playing a very successful hedging strategy. But that also creates some suspicions in Washington that ROK is just, as an ally, it's losing credibility in Washington and just creating suspicions that it's gravitating into China's orbit. So, it's a very difficult choice for the Moon administration. Basically, the Moon administration is a pro-China administration. It's filled with many former revolutionaries, leftist revolutionaries who drew inspiration from Mao Zedong's teachings and Chinese revolution. So they are very fond of China, basically. But public, the general public, as I said in my earlier intervention about the results of the polls taken before and after the Snyder deployment or China's retaliation, it's not very favorable to China. If to say more than 60% of Koreans are wary of China, while the government is trying very hard to cozy up to Beijing, to Xi Jinping. That's true. I think in terms of economic interdependence, another thing that we have to keep in mind is that, yeah, we had the FTA, we had all kinds of agreements to strengthen our economic partnership. But the fact is that even after the FTA entered into force, ROK's or the economic interdependence is decreasing. Last year, Korea's exports to China was about 17% of our total exports. That's still a very significant proportion, but it used to be in the high 20s in the past. So from 25% or something like that. We are now down to 17%. And if you put the imports and exports together, our dependence on China is still #1 market, but it's 16% of our total trade. So it's decreasing.
Yeah, so I'm really glad. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really glad that you raised that. But I want to ask, what do you think is the reason for that decrease? Do you think that it's because of fears about excessive dependency, or do you think it's about business conditions in China?
Well, the economics has played a major role, as the wages in China are increasing, and there are also strong competition from China on the same industry. I think Korean businesses are relocating to other areas like India, Vietnam, Indonesia. So Southeast Asia is replacing much of the loss of our market share in China. So the over dependence on China is now being resolved through relocation of our industries, our overseas offshore supply lines, and export markets to other areas of the Asia Pacific region. So, and I think political factor, the China risk factor also played a part. So there is a combination of factors, but I think the security risk, coming competition, not only between China and U.S., but competition between Korea and China is getting more acute in many areas. And China has not been very favorable to Korean investment in China as before.
Okay, this is actually a lead-in to the last question that I'm going to ask before I open it up. And I see we have a few questions that have been sent in, but we'll also ask for people who want to ask questions directly. But what I want to conclude with for now in terms of my questioning is the BRI. And it's striking to me that actually the Korean Peninsula has been an area where BRI has not been actively applied. And so I'm curious how China views Korea in the context of BRI, and also how South Korea views BRI. Is that an opportunity or an additional risk, since we've just been talking about South Korea's economic diversification? And maybe since Ambassador Chun was just talking about that, I'll have Ambassador Chun start by giving South Korean views of BRI, and then ask Yoon to say something about where Korea fits in the context of the broader BRI project. Ambassador Chun. Yes.
Yeah. I don't think there is much interest in BRI in South Korea. This is about China's strategy to win the hearts and minds of the Central Asia or South Asia, and India may see it as a strategy to encircle India and to contain India's influence as part of India-China strategic competition. So there is very little interest here. No strong views about BRI, but some strategies have thought about BRI, because that will, I think, as China expands into South Asia, Central Asia, China's competition, strategic competition with India will heat up. And to the extent that China expands its resources, the limited resources in its BRI initiative and its expansion toward the west and south, they will have less resources to spend for expansion in East Asia. So I have wishful thinking that BRI will, if China spends as much resources as possible on BRI, that will make East Asia more peaceful and secure.
Okay. Yoon, where does Korea fit in China's BRI approach?
Thank you, Scott. I think to answer that question, I think we might want to look at what BRI really is. BRI is a geo-economic strategy, apparently, and it has two goals. Outside China, it is to expand the Chinese strategic influence, there's no doubt. But inside China, BRI is primarily seen as an economic strategy to export China's overcapacity. The overcapacity especially associated with infrastructure development within the Chinese market. So when we look at the logic of BRI, is the Chinese government mobilizing Chinese resources, financial resources, to provide loans to recipient countries so that these loans will be used to procure the Chinese service, especially the construction contracts, as well the procurement of the Chinese labor and products. So when we think about the BRI in that perspective, you will realize that South Korea is not going to be a recipient country of BRI strategy, because South Korea is not in the category of countries that desperately needs funding for its domestic infrastructure development. So I think because of that, the BRI, when it was first raised, I think the most likely and most applicable country on the Korean Peninsula is actually North Korea, because of its dire need for infrastructure. So in that sense, I think what the Chinese has emphasized, South Korea's role in the BRI is not as a recipient country, but as a partner. For example, for joint financing of projects, and for example, South Korea joining AIIB as one of the founding members also aligns in that direction. And also whether South Korea could participate in public-private financing for BRI-related projects, or whether South Korea could be provide technical assistance or technical partnership with Chinese companies or Chinese entities in BRI projects in other countries, especially developing countries, like Ambassador pointed out, in Central Asia, in South Asia. So the angle that the Chinese have emphasized the most regarding South Korean BRI is the southern policy and northern policy, and how these policies would align or overlap with BRI, and whether some synergy could be developed from these two different national strategies. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We actually have a pretty long list of questions in the Q&A function. I don't know if we're able to open up to have people ask their question directly, but the first person I'd like to call on, if that is possible, is James Kim. Is it possible to unmute James so that he can ask his set of questions?
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Scott. I got a couple of questions for both Yoon-sun and Ambassador Chun. First question is, if the Sino-US relations become more confrontational, is this how would this impact South Korea's approach? Would it South Korea's approach to the alliance? Would it draw South Korea closer towards the U.S., or would it push South Korea further away from the U.S.? I'd like to get Yoon-sun's view from Beijing's point of view on this, and also Ambassador Chun's view on what he thinks the Moon administration's view or South Korea's view would be. And the second question relates to the U.S. presidential election. Yoon-sun kind of suggested in the earlier part of the presentation that Beijing has a preference for the Biden administration, Joe Biden in this election. do you, for Ambassador Chun, do you think that the Moon administration has a preference in the coming U.S. presidential election? If so, which candidate would be more preferable over the other? Thank you.
Okay, Ambassador Chun, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think in this confrontation between China and the U.S., as it heats up, I think the right answer for the ROK is to strengthen our alliance with the U.S. But I'm not quite sure whether President Moon will accept my view on that. I'm not sure about that. I think he will vacillate between China and he will continue to vacillate between China and the U.S. And he may wish to keep up his strategic ambiguity without choosing either side as confrontation, becomes worse. And the second question about the Moon administration's preference in between the two presidential candidates, I suppose that President Moon will prefer dealing with continuing to deal with President Trump. He might find it more comfortable dealing with President Trump. However erratic he may be, he knows how to deal with Trump, and I think he would prefer a known asset than a new president to deal with.
Okay, and Yun.
Thank you, James, for your question. I think for the Chinese, because they associate the recent escalation of tension with the deterioration of U.S.-China relations very much with the U.S. election season. So I think there is an expectation on the Chinese part that this relationship will stabilize, even just slightly, by next January, regardless of who wins. And I don't think they believe that President Trump will continue his current policy trajectory, meaning at this level, even if he wins in the November election. But in the scenario that this type of confrontation is going to continue or even exacerbate, I think South Korea's strategy will be a continued hedging strategy. And the level of hedging is going to deepen, and it will force South Korea to face and to deal with some very difficult choices. And I think there's a possibility that South Korea will acquiesce to China on some issues, but not on some other issues. So I think this hedging strategy will deepen.
Okay, the next question, I had a bunch of questions on North Korea that I didn't get to ask, and I see that Eunjung Cho from VOA has a North Korea question. And so I'd like to turn to her for her question.
Hi, Scott. Thank you. Ambassador Yun, thank you very much. So during Trump-Kim symmetry, China felt left out and took immediate actions to restore relations with North Korea. Lately, North Korea has been making statements supporting China in its rivalry with the United States. So what is China's current perception of its relations with North Korea? Does China feel North Korea is already on its side and do not need to make more efforts to win Kim Jong-un's heart and support? And how will possible next Kim Jong-un-Trump summit, possibly before the US elections in November, impact China's North Korea strategies? Thank you.
Okay, Yun, why don't you start?
Okay, I will give it a try. I think in light of the U.S.-China great power competition, for China, the strategic value of North Korea is significantly elevated. That if we say that China in the past was reluctant to abandon North Korea as its leverage, I would say that now China has no reason to abandon North Korea as a leverage, because in light of what we're seeing in terms of the U.S.-China relations, the Chinese biggest concern, or their biggest worry, is that the list of issues where U.S. needs China's cooperation is too short. And whenever Chinese talk about U.S. China needs cooperation, North Korea has always been used as a sterling example that see U.S. and China could create some common good through cooperation. But I think the result of that is in the short term, when China tries to prove that U.S.-China relations is not yet damaged beyond repair, and China is quite eager to find issues for cooperation with the United States, North Korea is always the easiest one. But in the long run, that will give China less reason or no reason to abandon North Korea or to pursue a policy that actively facilitate unification or even allow for unification to happen. Thank you.
Ambassador Chun, would you like to offer anything on that?
Well, about possibility of U.S. North Korea summit before the election, I'm very pessimistic about that. I don't think that a deal acceptable both to North Korea and U.S. Is going to be possible in the next 100 days or less than 100 days. So unless North Korea, make significant concessions, which I don't think is likely, any deal on North Korea's terms will not be helpful for, presidential election, for Trump's election, re-election. So I don't think there is any common room that can lead to,
Okay. Next question is from Bob Einhorn.
Thank you very much, Scott. You have two excellent panelists. I have a question about prospects for U.S. North Korea re-engagement, not in the before the November election. I agree with Ambassador Chun on that. But if there's going to be a Biden administration, Kim Jong-un at the end of last year made clear that he sees no current need for negotiations with the United States. Perhaps he's simply waiting for the results of the November election. But what would it take for a Biden administration to get negotiations on track? What modifications of its approach, of the U.S. approach, would be required? And what would China's role be in re-engagement of the United States with North Korea? Could the United States and China find some common ground on a negotiating position that could increase the prospects for engagement? Thank you.
Those are great questions. Who wants to start? Yun?
Sure, I could start. I think the issue, well, we always talk about U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea. I think the question really has come down to cooperation towards what? I think U.S. and China have very different end games coming to what the desired end game looks like for the Korean Peninsula. Like I mentioned, the Chinese would like to see a pro-China North Korea and at least a neutral South Korea on the Korean Peninsula. Unification is not necessarily something that China will ardently oppose, but it will be ardently opposed to by China if the security alliance with the United States will remain on the Korean Peninsula. So I think for this cooperation to work, we might want to discuss where cooperation towards what goal. If it's the management of North Korean provocation, for example, I think there are ample ground for Washington and Beijing to come together and talk about issues and areas that they can collaborate on. But I think if the end game is about how to force North Korea to denuclearize, I think on that issue there is going to be significant differences between Beijing and the United States. And also in light of this bipartisan consensus of China being the #1 national security threat to the United States, if it is indeed a bipartisan consensus and it is shared by a potential future Biden administration, I wonder what that means for U.S. engagement policy towards North Korea. Because if we identify China as the #1 problem, then does that mean that there's any flexibility in our approach towards North Korea? So those are the questions I think need to be answered before we can look into what kind of engagement can be initiated. Thank you.
Ambassador Chun?
I think the Moon administration will do everything it can to broker a re-engagement between U.S. and North Korea. But, well, resumption of talks is one thing, but striking a deal is totally another. I don't believe that a deal is possible. I know that North Korea is very interested in being re-engaged, but on its terms. And as long as North Korea sticks to its current position, I see no chance of any deal or any meaningful deal, because their current position is the same one as they held in Hanoi early this year. It was, their position is that they should be allowed to continue their nuclear buildup, but at a slower pace. They will shut down their Yongbyon complex on condition that they are allowed to continue enriching uranium outside Yongbyon. I don't think any U.S. government, whether there is somebody like Bolton or not, whether it's a Democratic administration or, Republican administration, to accept any deal that allows North Korea to keep building up its nuclear arsenal, unless North Korea agrees to a nationwide cessation of all nuclear activities or producing fissile material for nuclear weapons. I don't think U.S. will be in a hurry to make a deal with the U.S., make a deal with North Korea. So I think there will be efforts for re-engagement, maybe after election, by President Trump or President Biden. But I think it all very much depends on whether North Korea can come to terms with the U.S. on the starting point for the first stage of freeze. So that's I think vital for any agreement.
I'd just like to add to Ambassador Chun that at least publicly, in terms of North Korea's position, they've indicated that since Hanoi, the price has gone up. And so it might be even more challenging. I don't know what that, whether that is reflective of their actual position if engaged in a negotiation process. And then also, it seems to me that, the big question with regard to U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea is whether or not the North Korea issue can be compartmentalized from other issues in the relationship. And that, I think, actually possibly opens up the question of structure of the engagement process. I want to turn to Bill Mckinney as our next questioner. He has a big strategic question. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, let's see if am I coming through.
You're working.
Good. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate Ambassador Chun. His comments here have been very good. As Scott says, though, my question kind of jumps us up on the security, to more of the strategic question. That is that at this point in time, many believe that the Koreans should be concerned about the apparent reemergence of Beijing's historic suzerainty over Korean Peninsula. They increasingly understand that the PRC seeks to integrate with both Koreas until it can make them subservient to its interests. Question being is, does the return of a hegemonic China create the opportunity for Washington, Seoul, and Pyongyang to realign their security interests to their mutual long-term benefits? Thank you.
Ambassador Chun, why don't you start?
Yeah, I have no doubt that China's wish is to restore the tributary system or something akin to tribute system in East Asia. So China wants to return to the what it would consider as the traditional East Asian political order of the tributary system, under which Korea or any neighboring countries will be able to exercise their sovereignty only to the extent allowed by China, in a way that doesn't do any harm to China's vital interests. That's, I think, the tributary system they have in mind. But I don't think they will succeed in it. They will try very hard. But I think the U.S. ROK alliance will give ROK an insurance policy against that kind of attempt. So I think the strong alliance will answer to that kind of China's attempt.
Okay, Yoon?
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Bill, for the question. I think the answer is evidently. I think there is a space that the security interests of Washington, Seoul, and Pyongyang are aligned vis-a-vis China, given China's hegemonic intention in the region and also the behavior pattern that we have seen out of Beijing. But I think to address that issue requires commitments. So not only interest, not only common interest, but also commitments and the willingness to spend the necessary resources, and also to live with their the internal differences among the three parties to for that stars to align together. So for example, there are plenty of issues I think the Chinese will exploit in that process. The issues that we have talked today between U.S. and South Korea are some of the issues. I think there's also an issue of whether South Korea and North Korea will see their interests as aligned coming to China. If there is still a relatively hostile policy between North Korea and South Korea, then they might regard the conflicts between themselves is more significant or more important than their shared interest vis-a-vis a hegemonic China. So I think the management of that trilateral dynamic and also to the management of different perspectives and different prioritization of national interest will be the biggest challenge there. Thank you.
Yeah, I might just add on this question that I think that one of the underlying premises behind North Korea's approach to the US as a nuclear state is that it has strategic value in the context of China's rising influence. And so the deal I think that the North Koreans are interested in the US biting on is the idea that North Korea's strategic value, it has strategic value, and that it's actually a nuclear North Korea that makes it able to activate its strategic value. But I think that that is not the way that US security analysts have traditionally viewed North Korea. And so there's a huge gap in perception there between what North Korea desires for the US to see in North Korea and what the US actually sees. I want to go to Mark Mannion for our next question.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. Ambassador Chun, I wanted to push you a little bit on your assertion that President Moon is more pro-China than previous presidents, because I see lots of areas of continuity. You know, Park Geun-hye, after all, was in some ways much more aggressive in her outreach to China, at least in her first, you know, two and a half years of her presidency. Xi and President Lee, pursued an FTA with China, et cetera. So other than trying to schedule a summit with Xi Jinping, which after all, Prime Minister Abe is also trying to do, what other concrete signs do you see that Moon is more favorable to China than other South Korean presidents?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Mark. Well, yes, President Park Geun-hye, President Lee Myung-bak, they wanted to have good relations with China. They attach great importance to maintaining dialogue, smooth communication with China on strategic issues, and upgrading our economic relationship with China. But yeah, Park Geun-hye was also very fond of China. She believed she knew about China. But it was personal. It was her personal, preference. But in the case of, and basically, Park Geun-hye was also pro-alliance. Basically, she pursued better relations with China on the basis of strong alliance with the U.S. She created some doubts, suspicions in Washington when she joined, Putin and others when there was was it the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II or something like that, right? A big parade in Tiananmen. So that generated a lot of suspicions about her relations with China. But President Moon, if you look at who advised President Moon's national security policy, foreign policy, they are basically the pro-China, pro-North Korean former revolutionaries who built up their career in their pro-North Korean and anti-American activities. So they are basically anti-American in their hearts. They are working very hard to hide their sentiment once they came to power. But in their heart, in the bottom of their heart, they feel guilty about being in alliance. They feel ashamed of being in alliance with the US. They feel ashamed of relying on US for our national defense. That's why they are so keen on early upcon transfer. So the color, the ideological orientation of President Moon and his immediate entourage and those who advise him on foreign policy, national security policy, they are totally different people. So in that regard, what you see on the surface may look similar, but I think what they feel in their heart is fundamentally different. When they deal with China and with the U.S. So in that regard, I think President Moon and his administration are fundamentally different from previous conservative administrations.
Okay, we've only got about 7 minutes and we have about 5 questions in our queue. And so I'm going to take all of them and put them on the table here for our panelists to choose which ones they want to answer. Mark Tukola asks, is there anything China is doing to exacerbate tensions between South Korea and Japan? Maybe Ambassador Chun could answer that one. Linda Yar asks, do Korean students continue to pursue higher education in China? I'd like for you to answer that if possible. Glenn Ford makes I'm going to interpret this as a rhetorical comment about the whether or not escalating burden sharing demands is productive. And then Jay Brannigan asked a question about whether or not continued North Korean missile testing would help reverse the erosion of the ROK-US alliance. If either of you want to comment on that. And then I have 2 questions from Jonathan Pollock. One is, do our speakers see no difference between a Biden victory or a Trump second term? And the second question is the North Korea factor. Do you assume more of the same in the context of the Trump administration's failed efforts to induce movement on denuclearization? And so if you can make wrap-up comments that address some or all of those questions, that would be great. And I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Scott. I think on the issue of the South Korean students in China, I have to look at the most recent figure. But as of last year, I think China and South Korea still regard each other as the destination of the largest overseas student. So China hosts the largest number of South Korean students, and the South Korea also hosts the largest number of the Chinese students overseas. So on the issue of whether there is going to be a difference between a Biden presidency and the Trump second term, that's an intriguing question, because that's a question that I have been trying to tease out in the Chinese deliberation. Is it going to be different, or is it going to be based on this bipartisan consensus about China, so there's not going to be such much of a difference? I think the Chinese preliminary answer is that it's going to be different because what they see is that Biden's style, Biden's priorities, and Biden's approaches, such as reliance on the collective approach to issues such as China, is going to be significantly different. And also, the Chinese also see that Biden's potentially higher emphasis on issues from North Korea non-proliferation, denuclearization, or the global climate change is also going to be different, because they believe that Biden will reach out to China for cooperation on those issues. Thank you.
Okay, Ambassador Chun.
Okay, I'll just respond to two issues: burden sharing and the North Korean missile test. I think burden sharing cannot end in a way preferred by President Trump. I think President Trump picked the wrong issue with the Moon administration, because President Moon cannot budge very much here, because he and his party have been criticizing the conservative governments for sharing too much of the burden in the previous negotiations. So unless they are ready to deny themselves, to deny their own policy in the past, they cannot accept any significant increase in burden sharing. Another thing is that President Trump's threat to withdraw U.S. forces cannot work with President Moon's administration, because these people, the Moon administration and his political base, they do not, regret. They will not regret U.S. troop withdrawal. In their heart, they'll be delighted to see their lifetime goal is being realized. They have been fighting for their life for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. They will never, once in power, they will never ask the U.S. to withdraw their troops. But if U.S. withdraws on their own will, many of them will believe that's the best for them. That's they will see it as a blessing in disguise. So if it helps, standing firm helps in getting the U.S. to withdraw troops, I don't think they will be very worried about that. So U.S. has no negotiating leverage when it comes to burden sharing. And President Moon will believe that he has nothing to lose by standing firm. On North Korea's missile test, I don't think it will destroy the alliance. The new ROK National Security Team, which just came in yesterday, the other day. I think these are the people who will do whatever it takes to talk to the North Koreans. They will do anything to improve relations with North Korea, to promote economic cooperation with North Korea, even by going around sanctions. So they would not mind very much the missile test from North Korea, even if North Korea launches more missiles than before. The new team will not hesitate to embrace North Korea. So I don't think it will have any significant impact on the alliance.
Okay, well, this brings us to the end of our time, and I want to offer our panelists, on behalf of the audience, a note of thanks, and also know that you're getting invisible applause. Now that sports has returned, we realize that we need an applause soundtrack for these events, so we'll work on that. But let me also, on behalf of NCNK, thank everyone who has tuned in to this webinar. And I think we raised a lot of interesting issues, and this is a topic that I think we may need to return to perhaps post-election to see how things are looking. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.